Today, I want to talk about web programming. Now, there's a lot of people who think and will say that HTML and CSS is web programming, and that's not really the case. That's because there's no logic to it. HTML is a markup language. It is designed to take some plain text and make it much more readable, accessible, and understandable. And it does a great job of that. CSS is designed to stylize and to make things nicer to look at, more usable, and do other things like that. And it does a great job of that. However, with HTML and CSS, there's no programming logic or control structures or anything of that sort. However, there is programming that is available on the web. In fact, we can split that up into two different categories. The first of which is server-side programming. The second of which is client-side programming. And we're just going to talk briefly about both of these. So let's first look at the server-side programming. What that means is on your server, if you remember back from previous modules when we talked about servers, on that server you have to have installed the ability to run certain programming languages. Now, which language you have installed will depend upon what server and the operating system that's on that server, because some languages aren't available on certain server operating systems, as well as maybe what that host has provided. Now, if you have control of that, you can make a lot more choices. You'll also find that some languages do better on certain operating systems than others. And that's part of maybe why your server host, or maybe you if you're the host server and the host administrator, has made those changes. So the basic process is what would happen is a request would come into the software web server, the software that makes those file reads and then sends it out to the user. It's going to recognize that, hey, I have a server-side language that needs to process. It's going to send it to that processor. That processor is going to do some work, and then it's going to send it back to the web server software so it can be sent back to the client, probably as HTML. Now, like I said, there's a lot of languages that can be used on the server side. Some of these languages are familiar to other programmers because they're also used in other server applications and in desktop applications even. Things like C#. C# is a popular language that has a lot of different uses. It runs on the Windows operating system, and therefore you're going to find it on Windows servers. There's others like Perl, which is usually and mostly found on Unix and Linux, and PHP. You also have others like Python, Ruby, and many, many more. Now, which one you pick, like I said, is dependent upon what your server provides, maybe what you're comfortable with, or maybe someone that you hire to do that type of job. A server-side language can do lots of things, such as it can connect to a database and store information for long-term use. It can do processing and calculations. For example, if you need to calculate how many items are being purchased during this transaction on an e-commerce store. It can do things like encryption. For example, if you need to send data to a credit card processing company, you want to make sure it's encrypted and it's secure. You can write files and you can look up information. Server-side languages is what makes everything from social media sites to e-commerce sites to blogs and many, many more types of sites available and easy for people to use. The most popular language probably is PHP, and that's because it becomes pre-installed on most Linux-based servers. However, as I mentioned, there's a lot of other ones out there, and you need to pick the one that's right for you. Now, on the client side, it's a little bit different. Now, the client side is going to be in the end user's browser. So on the client side, we're talking about scripts that are going to run inside the end user's web browser. The most common language used is JavaScript by far. There has been some move to a language like TypeScript or even Python. However, that hasn't fully happened yet. It's not fully supported across most browsers, and so therefore we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on the JavaScript, or as it's sometimes known, ECMA script. Now, ECMA script is basically JavaScript. It's a very technical semantic as to which name you use, so you can feel free to use those kind of interchangeably. Now, I would like to point out that JavaScript is not Java, unlike what a lot of people think. So don't make that mistake. It's two very different languages, even though they share 4 letters. After that, there's not much similarity between the two. JavaScript allows you, however, to go in and make changes to an existing web page. You can add elements, change the content within an element, and even delete elements from your web page. You can see it used in a lot of different ways. For example, if you've ever been on a site like Amazon and you start typing in their search bar, it's going to bring up some list of suggested possibilities for you. Well, how does it do that? It looks at the content of a web page, sees that you're typing in the search bar, sends information to the server, which does some server processing, sends that data back to your browser, creates some elements to display that drop-down list with list of names and maybe pictures beside it and things like that. You didn't have to reload the page or anything. It's all being handled what we call asynchronously, and it's all being handled by JavaScript. That's it. So we can make changes such as changing the content and what we see. We can add and remove styles and make other stylistic changes. We can add the content like we did for that little preview of the drop-down so people have a little bit easier way of finding things. We can do simple things like check to see if a form field is properly filled out. Now, we obviously can't check to see if it's the right answer, but we can check to make sure that the data is the right type of data or that data does exist. So there's a lot of different things that JavaScript can do on our client side. How much? Well, if you've ever looked at something like Gmail or Google Docs or Google Sheets, almost all of that is created with JavaScript. There's very little base HTML that's created. All the stuff around it is all generated by JavaScript. JavaScript was so important to Google that they created the Chrome browser to be more efficient in how it handled JavaScript so that it could display their web applications such as Gmail and others that you might use would be faster and easier to use. This has become the Chromium project and is now the basis of about 90 to 95% of all web browsers on the internet. And that's a slightly different story. However, their JavaScript engine is really the star of what Chrome is and why Chrome is so important. Their JavaScript engine handles all that back-end scripting, and for any website that is heavy on the scripting, Google Chrome is typically faster because of that. Now, to add a script to a server is really easy. Typically, we're going to add it at one of two places. First, at the bottom of the page, shortly before the end body tag, and we can have a script tag like this. That script tag, we can put JavaScript actually right there in between that opening and closing tag. The other option is our opening script tag. We can use the SRC or source attribute. When we do that, we can reference an external file. Now, the reason for doing that is the same reason we use external CSS style sheets. I don't want to have to make you download this content for every page that you're on, especially if it's something like I'm on Amazon and my search is part of every page of my site. I'd rather you download a small file, cache it, and then not have to re-download it each time. That's going to speed up the browsing experience for you. It's going to reduce the amount of server requests that have to be made and the amount of bandwidth I'm going to transfer. So it's a win-win for everyone. Now, the other place that we can put it is up towards the top. And we'll typically put it inside of the head tag. We'll especially do this if we're going to use something called the async. The async, and there's some other ways that we can do this, means that we're not going to wait for this to download. It's going to happen offline and is independent. If we're not using something that's asynchronous or to be downloaded later, because the web browser is going to wait to download the entire JavaScript, see if it needs to run anything, and then continue downloading the rest of our page. So we typically don't put inside a head unless it's some sort of asynchronous type of file. So that's the second type of programming that you might do on the web. First is your server side, second is your client side. We're going to look at some very simple JavaScript client side programming in the next module.